Hi everyone! In this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a brown bear in graphite. Now the first thing that I like to start off with is the eye. The only exception would be if I was working on a background and I would do that first, just because that is behind that subject. So for me personally, I just like to get that done first and then I'll start working on the animal. And as I've said, the first thing there is the eye. Now I want to make sure that I've got the shape of the eye right. And the one thing that I really noticed when working on this reference photo is how small the bear's eyes actually are in relation to the size of their head. So I do feel that this is something that we need to pay very close attention to, because our brain may have a tendency to think, no, that eye needs to be bigger. And we may even start to subconsciously make that larger in that drawing process. So that is something that I really wanted to focus on throughout that stage of the drawing. Now onto the fur, and of course this is something that I focused on thoroughly on the real-time version on Patreon, where I'm really focusing on the layering process and the contrast. Now I had a few requests from Patreon members to show how to draw wet fur, so this project here is going to be a great demonstration of that when we get onto the fur on the side of the face and the neck. Now before I could work on that section, I needed to start on the area of fur around the eye and on the bridge of the nose. Now you can see here how my pencil strokes are starting to curve following the structure underneath the skin. So the fur direction is never random, it will follow the underlying bone and muscular structure. So the way that the bridge of the nose is flat at the top and then it curves over the side of the muzzle, I really have to be making sure that I've captured that in the way that I move my pencil. So the fur direction is going to be really massively influencing how three-dimensional our finished artwork looks. Now I have a video here on YouTube, it's my top tips for drawing realistic fur in graphite. I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest. But three things that I talk about in that video are fur length, fur thickness and fur direction. Now the fur length here is also important, just as important as the fur direction. If I make my pencil strokes too long for the bridge of the nose where I've just worked, that's going to then make that area look quite fluffy. So I need to be making sure that I'm paying, again, very close attention to that reference photo. Now as I start to build in this base layer of the fur, I'm really just focusing on the fur direction. I'm not looking at anything else other than that, and I start to build up my layers, reinforcing my contrast. Now of course the fur direction and fur length, both of those things are being influenced at the same time when you're creating that pencil stroke. But the other aspect is how thick those pencil strokes should be. And because I've created this tutorial with a voiceover while I'm drawing on Patreon, that's one aspect that I do focus on thoroughly, because determining the correct pencil technique, how we should move the pencil, how much pressure should be applied, how thick those pencil strokes should be and so on, is something that's going to massively affect the sort of texture that we're going to be creating. So when we're using our pencils, it can be adjusted very slightly to get a different look, and that would be required on the same drawing in some situations. And because this bear had wet fur, but the top section of this fur is very short, you don't have that separation of that wet fur where it clumps together in the same way. This one project really does cover lots of different techniques that can then be applied across many other fur situations, different reference photos and different textures. Now if you've seen many of my other videos here on YouTube, you'll know that I focus a lot on the layering process. This is key when drawing photorealism or you're trying to take that art to the next level. The more layers that we add here, the more depth we're going to create. Now of course there is a limit where we can actually start to overwork something, so that is always a real important thing to bear in mind. But with something like this, the level of realism that we're achieving here, it can't be done in one or two layers. You do want to be working with multiple layers and build up those layers gradually. So as I start to work on the fur underneath the jaw, this is where it starts to become longer and you can see more of that wetter fur texture. Now here, in order to get that wet fur appearance, we have to be focusing on really good contrast. So you want your shadows really, really dark and your highlights nice and bright. But you'll notice that when I work on the darker sections, I'm not just using one layer and trying to get that as dark as I possibly can with something like a 9B pencil. I'm still building up those layers gradually. Now that's something that we're going to be really focusing on the next stage of this when we start working on that longer, wetter fur. But I do want to be paying very close attention to my contrast. Now with contrast, although it is your darks being dark, your highlights being bright, I put a lot of emphasis on the midtones as well. So look at how I'm starting to build up the fur on the ear. All of these values so far, they're not the darkest, but they're also not the brightest. I want to be focusing on all of the greys in between, and it's now when I come back in and reinforce those darks, and then I can come back in with some highlights. So the layering process here and the contrast, they really do go hand in hand. It's something to pay very close attention to. And even at this base layer stage where I've used graphite powder, look at how I'm here just mapping in my main lights and darks and where they're positioned. I'm not trying to get that graphite powder as dark as what I will get my layers with my pencils. That's not the aim of that graphite powder layer, but it is influencing where the accurate position of my lights and darks are. Now this is something that's just as important as the fur direction. So I mentioned at the beginning of this video how the fur direction, it influences the structure of the face, and that's also the same when we talk about the position of our highlights and shadows. So for instance, this area here that I'm working on, notice how the darker sections are curved over and then they come down towards the lower edge and lower right corner. This is helping to make it look like it's going over the eye socket and then attaching onto the rest of the skull. So the position of these highlights and shadows is something that we really do want to get right. The midtones and everything else in between help to soften those transitions. As you can see here, it starts to look a little bit blocked in to start with, but that's absolutely fine. As we continue to build on the layers, that's where we get that softness. So when I work with fur that's a little bit more difficult, I'll break that up into even more layers. The more layers that I'm adding, the more simplified that process can be. Now that may sound a little strange because the more layers we add, often that's thought that it becomes more complex. But if we try to restrict ourselves and only work with 2 or 3 layers, we're trying to force all of that detail in a much shorter period of time. And although adding more layers of course does take time, if we're trying to get this end result with 2 or 3 layers, which won't happen, but if we're trying to do that, we're then going to end up getting stressed, and that's going to take longer. It's going to extend that drawing time, because we find that we start making mistakes as well. So if you feel that your graphite drawings are a little bit muted, they don't quite have that wow factor that you're after, then adjusting your contrast through going in and adding more layers, darkening up your shadows, brightening up your highlights will make a huge difference to that end result. Now throughout this drawing so far, I've worked on small sections, so 1 ear at a time or 2 or 3 square inches of the fur. This is something that I like to do in my work because I feel that I'm more motivated to come back to the easel. So if I decided to leave this session where it is now, it already looks like that reference photo. There is a high level of photorealism here achieved at this stage. So I know that I could put the pencils down and I'm already looking forward to coming back to the easel on the next drawing session. Now if you're an artist that likes to work in whole individual layers, so you do your first layer of the entire subject and then your second layer and so on, that of course is not a problem. We all have our own ways that we prefer to work. But if you do start to become overwhelmed and stressed, it's usually because we're focusing on too much of a larger area. Now a great example of this is where we start to now work on the longer, wetter fur. This in the reference photo, we would look at that and think, I have no idea where to start. All of this fur is clumped together, it's all different shapes, it's going in different directions. Where do I start? Now if ever I have that feeling, I will break it up into even more of those layers as I've mentioned earlier. And here, this doesn't look great. But the one thing that we need to bear in mind is that if we continue and trust that process, we build up those layers, we make alterations as we go, only focusing on one section at a time, this starts to look more like that reference photo. But we've also not allowed ourselves to get stressed either. Now I know that we're all going to get stressed in some part of that drawing process to some degree. It is normal, but overcoming that is a really important factor. So I want to be focusing this Patreon tutorial to show how to cope with that when it does occur in our drawings. Now I've spoken about pencil technique throughout this, but the eraser technique as well is also just as important. So I'm using a combination of erasers here depending on the effect that I needed. Now what I'm working with here is breaking this up into those clumps of fur. I can then isolate the darks and the lights, and then I can come in with my erasers and my pencils to help break that process up even more. Now when I worked with the wet fur, it really does have more of those harsher edges, but notice how they're all curved. It's not about getting that wispy look because that's going to make the fur look dry. I had to really try to force myself here at some point to make sure that I kept those harsh edges. Now because I don't draw wet fur hardly at all compared to the dry fur textures, This is something that I had to keep reminding myself throughout the drawing process. I really did have a tendency to come in, and you'll see it a couple of times here, to add in some of those lighter highlights with my erasers. But what that was doing is creating a softer texture. Now it doesn't matter, I haven't ruined anything, but I did have to come back in and with my darker pencils and correct the shape of those clumps of fur. So when drawing wet fur, it's very important to make sure that you've still got the curved shapes, you don't want any straight lines, but that you don't also have any of those finer hairs in between those sections of fur, because that's when you're going to end up creating that drier look. Now what I ended up doing as well in the real-time version is I just focused on this one section for a drawing session, and then I finished off the rest of this portrait the following day. Because this part here in the lower corner, although it's not as complex, working on that wet fur had actually taken an awful lot of concentration. So I wanted to be making sure that I never then rushed this last section of the portrait. Now this is something that I talk about in every one of my YouTube videos pretty much, because when we get to that last maybe hour or two, it's very easy to start rushing. Now also, by having a day in between, I was able to come back to the easel and look at this drawing with fresh eyes. I therefore noticed straight away that I'd made this wet fur have a bit more of those fluffier edges that I've just mentioned. So that's something that I'm going to then fix when I come back to working on that area. So when you look at something with fresh eyes, it's not just about taking a break and then feeling that we're wasting that drawing opportunity. It can actually really help with taking that art to the next level, helping correct some of the mistakes that we might have made that we just weren't noticing earlier on. Now this section was a prime example of where I was creating highlights that I just didn't like the look of. And again, this happens many times, and it's something that I would never cut out of a real-time tutorial on Patreon. I would always leave any mistake or a layer that I don't like in place, because that's what we learn from. That's what improves our drawing skills. So here you'll see that many times I come in with some erasers, I create some lines, I don't like them, and I draw back over them. And that leads on to a question about one of the erasers that I use in pretty much every single one of my animal drawings, and that is a Tombow mono eraser. Now the question is that the eraser doesn't really lift the graphite, and the highlights either don't show up at all or they're really dull. Now I find that the way that the graphite is applied to the paper massively affects how well erasers work. So if we have burnished early on with the pencils, now burnishing is where you have flattened the tooth of the paper by using excessive pressure, then when you've done that, the erasers are going to have a hard job to lift that graphite from the surface. The other thing that can make the erasers struggle is if you have used one solid layer of a dark, soft pencil. So for instance, this area of the fur here that's really dark, look at how many layers I'm using here. I'm starting off with a mid-tone and darkening it up. If I'd have just gone in here with a 9B and made a really solid dark layer, I find that the erasers have more difficulty removing those highlights. So how the graphite is applied is crucial in how the erasers work. And obviously the erasers here are helping to build up so much additional texture. The layering process is so important to get right if we're trying to get this level of detail. And at the beginning of this video, I mentioned about the fur length, fur thickness and fur direction. We need to be paying attention to all three of those things when we work with our erasers as well. Look at how those highlights are curved, the change of direction. I've got a variation in how thin or how thick some of those lines are. It's all so important. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And as I've mentioned in this tutorial, if you would like to draw along to the real-time version of this bear, then I will link my Patreon in the description below. I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.